Fujifilm X-T series of cameras have been regarded as a staple in the modern street photography circle due to its retro design and film simulations. And in the mid-range prosumer market, Fujifilm has gone relatively uncontested for almost a decade. That is, of course, until Nikon Zf entered the chat. So at relatively the same price point, who is now the retro street camera king of the hill? Let's find out. When we discuss the Fuji X-T series of cameras, we will of course discuss the X-T5, which is the latest one, but we'll also sprinkle in some details of the X-T4 and X-T3, especially that X-T3 because I've shot with the X-T3 for an extended amount of time, in addition to the fact that a lot of people still hold on to the X-T3. So getting into the Fujifilm specs, the Fuji X-T5 has a 40 megapixel sensor, and then with the X-T3 and X-T4, that was a 26 megapixel sensor. In regards to photo burst speeds, the X-T5 can shoot up to 20 frames per second, whereas because of the lower megapixels, the X-T4 and X-T3 can shoot up to 30 frames per second, of course with a tiny crop. When it comes to the video specs of the X-T5 can shoot up to 6.2K with a crop. Now, in its 4K settings, it can shoot up to 60 frames per second, but do note that the 4K in the X-T5 is subsampled instead of oversampled, which means it will appear a little less sharp than its younger siblings. In the X-T3 and X-T4, it can shoot up to 60 frames per second in 4K with a slight crop, and that video is oversampled. All three cameras shoot 10-bit internal with f-log, with the X-T5 having f-log 2, which is supposed to give you a little bit more dynamic range. The X-T4 has a flip-forward screen because it was trying to be the perfect hybrid camera, but its users weren't fond of that, so Fujifilm retracted and went back to their flip-up screen on the X-T5. When we look at the Nikon Zf, it's got a 24 megapixel sensor, but note that it is a full frame sensor compared to the crop sensors found in the X-T series of cameras. For photo mode, it can shoot up to 30 frames per second. In video mode, it shoots a downsampled 4K video up to 60 frames per second with a crop. It shoots 10-bit internal with N-Log. It also has dual card slots, and it's got the latest X-Speed 7 processor, which is found in the flagship Z8 and Z9 series of cameras. Now that we've gone through the specs, let's talk about the body and handling of both of these cameras. So when you look at them, I would say that they're relatively the same in terms of dials and functions found on the bodies. Starting off with the Fujifilm, they're on their 5th iteration of making these retro-styled cameras, and so they've perfected the formula, and the Fujifilm is lighter and smaller, which gives it a huge advantage. Coupled with your smaller lenses, this is an advantage for Fujifilm because you'll have a better experience taking it out onto the streets. When it comes to the Nikon Zf, it is actually deceptively large. It may look small in pictures and it may look like the same size as the X-T series of cameras, but it's actually quite larger and a lot heavier when you compare the two of them together. Another place in which the Fujifilm has a great advantage is the fact that it's got a better grip than the Nikon Zf. The Nikon Zf has barely any grip, but this can be remedied by ordering a small rig grip that you can attach to the Nikon Zf, but note that it is an additional purchase of about $40 US. So all in all, while both of them are built very solidly with great materials, I would actually give the advantage to the Fujifilm just because handling it and taking it out into the streets is a much more enjoyable experience if you do not have the additional grip for the Nikon Zf. Now, when it comes to image quality, this is going to be very subjective. Nikon has really good color science. It's got a dedicated black and white mode dial that you can flip, and it has a bunch of creative styles built into the camera. Now, when it comes to Fujifilm, obviously this is where all the fanboys are going to stand up and go crazy. So yes, Fujifilm does have an advantage. Not only have they been making film throughout their history, they've been making these retro cameras for a while. So when you combine the two, what you get with the Fujifilm is a camera that not only looks stylish, but it has these built-in film simulations, which are kind of like filters that go over your JPEGs to mimic the look of the film that they used to make. And they do it the best in the game. They've got so many film simulations, and on top of that, they've got a dedicated community of individuals that are building film recipes, which is a tweak on these film simulations to mimic other film stocks like the Kodak film stocks out there. So in regards to creative styles and what you can get, especially in JPEGs, image quality, you'd say that Fujifilm might win there. But again, this category is very subjective because another thing you do have to consider is the fact that Fujifilm has a crop sensor and Nikon has a full frame sensor. Now, most people are going to argue that this makes no difference, whereas to some individuals it does make a difference. I tend to prefer full frame sensors because you can get cleaner images in low light compared to the Fujifilm, especially when you consider the X-T5, which has a 40 megapixel sensor, versus the Nikon Zf. The pixels in the Nikon Zf are going to be larger than what's found in the X-T5, so in low light, the Nikon Zf is going to do a lot better. Again, you can get very deep in this whole argument, and we can talk about equivalent lenses to get the same amount of light gathering abilities, but you know what? We're just going to keep it very simple. When it comes to Fujifilm, their advantage is they've got those film simulations that you can bake into the JPEGs, which at this time, they are currently unmatched. The creative styles found in the Nikon Zf do not compete with Fujifilm's film simulations. On the other hand, Nikon does have that full frame sensor, and not only does it give you an advantage in low light, you do got to consider that it's much easier to achieve a shallower depth of field, especially with more affordable lenses on a full frame sensor compared to a crop sensor. On a crop sensor, you'd have to spend a lot more money to get an equivalent lens that can give you a similar depth of field. So let's talk about autofocus for a second. When it comes to the X-T3, the autofocus is decent, very workable, but not great continuous autofocus, so you got to keep that in mind. With the X-T4, same deal. Same sensor, relatively same processor. You're not going to see the greatest continuous autofocus, although it is a tiny step better than the X-T3. When it comes to the X-T5, massive improvement. This is the first time I would say that I'd be comfortable taking the X-T5 out to do continuous autofocus shooting with the camera. When it comes to the Nikon Zf, amazing story here. Nikon has brought the X-Speed 7 processor from the flagship cameras in the Nikon Z8 and Z9 down to a wonderful prosumer camera in the Nikon Zf. And let me tell you, that autofocus system is amazing. I spent the last week testing it out in different scenarios from professional shoots to trade shows, and I can tell you that the Nikon Zf is amazing when it comes to the autofocus performance. It is just as good as the Nikon flagship cameras, even though it doesn't share the same stack sensor. In this category for autofocus, I am going to give Nikon the win because objectively they are better than Fujifilm. But do note that Fujifilm is not far behind. It is still a good autofocusing camera. So going back to the beginning, when you look at the specs, they're pretty much neck and neck. Yes, Nikon has that full frame sensor, but Fujifilm makes up for it with their plethora of video specifications. When you consider image quality, Fujifilm naturally takes the win because they've been doing this for a very long time. They've got film simulations that are built from the film that they used to make, and so most people would say Fujifilm takes the win here. For me personally, I do prefer the Nikon color science, and the Fujifilm's simulations, while awesome, don't really speak to me because I like to edit my own raw files, and so it's not necessarily an advantage for me, but most people will gravitate to the image quality of the Fujifilm. When it comes to the body and handling, once again, Fujifilm wins in that category. They've been doing this for many years. The X-T5 is the 5th iteration of the X-T series of cameras, and it is built solid with great handling. You can remedy the poor handling of the Nikon Zf by attaching a small rig grip, but of course that is an optional purchase. When it comes to autofocus, simply put, Nikon is better, right? The X-T5 is a lot better than it used to be in the past, and with the X-T5 you get great continuous autofocus. In the X-T3, X-T4, not so much, but it's still good performers. The ZF is in another ballgame. It shares the same processor as its flagship Z8 and Z9 cameras, and so in this category for autofocus, Nikon ZF gets the win. When it comes to the lens selection, Fujifilm has more native glass built for the X mount. However, Nikon makes up for this by being able to adapt your large selection of f-mount lenses, so in this category it will be a tie. So in conclusion, when you tally up all of the scores, of course, fanboys rejoice. You can put your pitchforks down, you can take your fingers off the keyboard, you don't have to crucify me. Yes, Fujifilm is the leader in this category still. They've got many years of experience here on the 5th iteration of the X-T series of cameras, and they perform very, very well. But do consider this, even though Fujifilm is the natural winner, they've got those film simulations, to me, my personal winner is the Nikon ZF, and here is why. I love the Nikon color science. I love full-frame sensors, and I don't necessarily use film simulations all that often. And so, the better camera for me is the Nikon ZF, and I will continue to use it. With that said, I'm not getting rid of the Fuji. It's still going to be in my arsenal. I still think it has a valuable place in my arsenal, and if you are considering the Fuji, you will not regret your decision. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you appreciate the effort that I put into making this video, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up, and please do subscribe to this channel. We do have a lot more video coming. Like I said, we shot a comparison between the ZF and the GFX medium format cameras, which is a weird, odd, maybe unfair comparison, but it may surprise you, so you want to stay tuned for that, as well as a lot of other comparisons coming. Once again, thank you so much for checking out this video. Have yourselves a wonderful day.